Welcome to Freaky Fandoms. I am Andrew, and today with me is a special guest I've been looking forward to talking with for the show for a bit, Mr. J. Blake Fichera. How are you doing tonight?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, thank you for being on. I wanted to invite you on, and I gave you the option of what we might talk about because of your history, your background, the work that you're in for the entertainment industry and the film industry, and especially your work with soundtracks and scoring. And you picked a really cool topic for tonight that I'm really excited to talk about. Why did you want to discuss some Dario Argento tonight?
Well, he's been one of my favorite directors for a very long time, and
Sure.
I don't know, I feel like I don't really get that much of a chance to talk about him. We've covered him a few times on Saturday night movie sleepovers. We did Suspiria last year around Halloween time.
Oh, nice.
And we did Deep Red a couple years ago. But I don't know. I'm always up for it, and you wanted to talk about a film that I don't think it'll be a long time before we get to that film on Saturday night movie sleepovers. So
For a bit, not really going to be jumping into that one anytime soon.
well, it's we cover a wide variety of things on Saturday night movie sleepovers, and I just don't know if when we're going to do another Argento movie, and if we do, if this is going to be the one we do next. So.
Well, you're an interesting figure. You're someone who, I'm really happy to know through the film community that's out there online on Twitter, especially. And you mentioned Saturday Night Sleepovers, but you've got quite a few things that you do, and I think the most interesting thing for me is Scored to Death. So for folks listening, why don't you talk a little bit about what Scored to Death is and kind of what all comprises that, because it's kind of mind-blowing who you've talked to, what kind of conversations you've had, and what output you have. It's really impressive.
Well, thank you. Scored to Death kind of started in 2013. I'd always been a big fan of movie music, and then in my teens and then early in my college years, I got very into horror movie music. In my teens, I got very into John Carpenter, and then when I got to college, I got very into things like Goblin and Fabio Frizzi and stuff like that. And it was just a passion that I had ever since then. In like 99 or 2000 or 2001, Claudio Simonetti, who was in Goblin, formed a band called Daimonia, and they put out an album called Dario Argento Tribute. And right around that time, also, Goblin got back together to do the soundtrack for Sleepless, the Dario Argento movie, Non Ho Sono. And so I just was very into that stuff all the time, and I would listen to it. And then miraculously, Goblin toured for the first time since,
and they've been broken up for like 20 years or longer. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they had different incarnations throughout the 70s and into the early 80s, but they kind of got together under this banner of New Goblin, and they toured Europe and I think Japan and Australia. And then when they came here to America, they just dropped the New. And even though it was the New Goblin lineup, they went on as Goblin, and I went to go see them in Brooklyn. And it just, it's one of those things, and I've been very lucky to see many fantastic concerts in my lifetime. I see more live music than like the average person. There are definitely concert goers that see more live music than I do, but I'm a big live music guy. And
well, you're also a performer. You're someone who plays music live for a living. You've been in different bands, but I didn't mean to interrupt. It's just something that makes me think. Of course, you're that ingrained into that kind of entertainment.
Yeah. I've been playing music in New York City for over a decade now.
That's awesome.
Some rock stuff. My solo stuff is blues. I'm a proud inductee into the New York Blues Hall of Fame.
Oh, hell yeah.
Which was a great honor a couple years ago. But, seeing Goblin live was one of those things that I just never thought was ever going to happen. And it just kind of sparked this huge deep dive into listening to nothing but Goblin for I mean,
Everything from
basically
Profundo Rosso to Bio Omega to
throughout
all the deepest cuts.
throughout the entire book. That's other than listening to other film music as research, I just listened to Goblin for like 3 years straight. It was crazy.
That's awesome.
But seeing them live kind of
Yeah.
sparked this thing in me. And to make a long story short, I wanted to find reading material on Goblin and Claudio Simonetti, and in turn, much the genre music as a whole. But the Goblin show was really kind of the seed that got planted. And then I just discovered that there was no book or material that it didn't exist what I was looking for.
Like nobody had really been documenting them or their history or interviews with them or,
Well,
Claudio Simonetti stuff. And
yeah, at the time
book
there was
format.
a Italian book, but it was in Italian.
Sure.
And now that book's been translated into English. But at the time there was really nothing, and so then the question came was like, maybe I should do it.
Yeah. Yeah. The what am I going to do about that?
And I
Is
had
anybody
written,
going to do anything?
and I had written. I had interviewed people. I wrote for a blues website for a few years, and I had interviewed people. So it wasn't like this crazy. I've never written for a publication, and I've never interviewed anybody. I'm just going to do this. There was a little bit of a background that gave me a little bit of confidence.
Some online journalism and some PR work sort of stuff.
Yeah, and I had interviewed blues musicians for this website. Some of my heroes, like Leslie West from Mountain, and
Oh, cool.
Steve Cropper, from
That's
Booker T
awesome.
and the MGs and the Blues Brothers Band. And
Hell yeah, man.
so I just I kind of dove into it. I mean, there's longer aspects of this story, but so I decided that I was going to write this book. And then I just started thinking about, well, who would I want to talk to? And I started approaching composers, finding contact information, and just approaching them and asking them if they wanted to be involved. And everybody that I actually was able to reach said yes. And so the book, Scored to Death, Conversations with Some of Horror's Greatest Composers. Basically, I started writing it in early 2014 is when the first interview happened, even though I had been planning it for a little while. And then it came out in summer of 2016.
Yeah.
The same summer that John Carpenter went on tour, which was another,
Yes.
which was another big, I never in a million years would have thought that I'd be seeing a show like that, to see John Carpenter live, and then it happened. And then I took some time off from that. I mean, I was promoted the crap out of it, but I always wanted to continue talking to composers because I found the book very rewarding in that aspect.
Well, you've got a second one coming too, right?
Yeah, but before that, when it didn't look like a second one was going to happen, I started doing it as a podcast, Scored to Death, the podcast.
Yeah.
Because the book didn't ever seem like it was another book didn't seem like it was in the cards. But I wanted to continue talking to composers. And then after doing the podcast for a while, the opportunity arose for me to kind of parlay that into a second book. And so right now I'm working on a second book. It's really, honestly, it's probably I've already announced it, but it's probably way too early to announce it because it's not coming out. I'm not going to be done with it for like a year. So,
Well, it's something for folks to look forward to because you've got the first book out right now, which I was really easily able to get a copy of through Amazon. And I've been browsing and picking through it, and it's been great. And then I've listened to episodes of your show, which are all over the place. I've got you followed on Spotify and downloaded even on iTunes. But it's really cool that you're doing this kind of work because I'm a genre film fan and a film music fan too.
yeah.
So when you're talking about, doing deep dives into Goblin, I'm thinking of like when the old Anchor Bay Dawn of the Dead 4-disc box set came out and the menu title screens had that alternate cut of the Alba Morti Viventi on it with that really slow rhythmic bass line and then just starting to get further and further into their work and Claudio Simonetti's solo stuff after Tenebrae and everything. So, it's right up my alley and I absolutely love it. And the way that you talk about going and seeing Goblin makes me think of going and seeing, of course, like you said, John Carpenter, because I never thought in a million years I'd get to see Prince of Darkness played live, or In the Mouth of Madness,
Yeah.
or They Live, you know? And it's just amazing. But that's a question for you. Were you a film fan first or a music fan first?
Um, you know what?
Or
I
was it
don't
kind of
know.
both?
I think I kind of was both. I mean, music was always a big thing in my family, even though like my parents didn't play music, and
Hmm.
my older brother didn't actually start playing music until way after I was gigging in New York City. He decided to take it up. I suspect he came to see me live, and I suspect that maybe that was
Wanted some of that?
he wanted to get
See if
involved.
I can
But
pick up a
it's been
guitar, and
fun. It gives
that's
us
cool.
something to talk about now. We talk guitars now. Um, so
That's
music was
awesome,
always a
man.
big thing, and we had soundtracks on vinyl in my parents' collections, and we listened to film music just like we listen to any other kind of music, especially my dad and my mom. My brother not so much. When my brother, when we were growing up, was into like Van Halen, but
Sure.
alongside of that was you know uh, Vangelis and John Williams, and we'd listen to the Superman. I would make my dad put the Superman soundtrack on in the car when I
Yeah.
was little. As soon as we got in the car, we had to pop in that tape. And but
So,
then
so you knew names like Jerry Goldsmith, you know, from an early age. Like you
yeah,
knew who was making the music for these films, and you were interested in the score that went along with the movie.
yeah. But at first, it was just music.
Yeah.
Before at first when you're a little kid, you're like 6, 7, maybe even younger.
Hmm.
It doesn't really like in the you kind of understand that it's from a movie, but you don't really understand that connection. And soundtracks, like I was in love with the music from Singing in the Rain
Okay. Yeah. Sure.
when I was a kid, and I love and to this day that's one of my favorite movies of all time.
Right on.
But movies were also huge. I mean, in terms of my dad would take us to the movies a lot. My parents were divorced, and they were basically divorced from whenever as early on as I could remember, really. So,
Hmm.
getting to see my dad and then my dad taking us to movies, I think that's one of the reasons why I got very into like it was seemed like a real treat,
Yeah. Just
and
kind of
every
the
and
initial like budding force to lead up to
yeah.
being a cinephile.
And every once in a while, he would come and like pick me up at my grandmother's house on a weeknight
Hmm.
and take me to see like Transformers the movie
Oh, it's
or
great.
Flight of the Navigator. It was like,
Yeah.
oh, Dad's coming on like a Wednesday, not on a Friday night or a Saturday, and he's gonna take me to a movie.
Yeah.
So I think that's where it started. Plus, we're part of the video store generation, and my
Hmm.
dad, at a really early on, had this crazy machine called a VCR, and you could go to Rite Aid and rent
Sure.
movies, and so it was just we were very lucky to grow up at a time when we were the first generation to really have like the first like generation as kids to have
Hmm.
access to rewatch movies
Yeah.
and have access to movies from a video store and then also things like HBO and cable. So,
Totally.
I think we got fed movies in a much different way than even, my brother did. He's 5 years older than me, and obviously he
Hmm.
did too. But when he was, it didn't hit him until he was 5 years older than I was when it hit me. So it's just, it's in our DNA kind of to be movie lovers. It's just around.
That makes
And
total sense. I mean, that was also during a time when, home video being available in those formative years and it being so new, it was almost like, oh, we gotta make a weekend out of going to the video store, getting 5 videos for a discount amount, and then just burning through them all weekend because we gotta return them on Monday, so we're on the clock. So you're getting, all this going on, and there's no urgency like that anymore these days, and there's no kind of like treasure hunting that's going on other than just kind of flicking through Netflix. But that makes me think like what was the path that led you down to discovering and then diving into Argento?
well, when I was in high school, well, I get a little bit into this in the introduction to my book in terms of horror. And then when I was doing
Sure.
promotion for the book, a lot of people asked me about horror movies and how I got into them. I mean, in a
Mm.
way, horror was always a bit of a presence, because again, like video stores, when we grew up, there was a lot of horror on television. There was a show called Werewolf about a
Oh
werewolf.
yeah, I mean there was monsters. Like one of the first tapes I ever watched was The Omen, and
Yeah,
the music in that film, of course, is one of the ones that stuck with me forever.
sure.
But that was just all out there. So if someone asks, "Oh, what got you into horror?" I mean, really, all you got to do is turn on a TV, and it's on at least one channel right now
Oh
or
yeah,
somewhere.
but there was like Friday the 13th, the series, and Tales from the Crypt became popular, and so I mean,
Yeah,
in a
Tales from
way,
the Dark Side too.
Tales from the Dark Side,
So good.
classic example. And so, in a way, horror was always a presence, and of course, again, the '80s was the era of like the slasher monster killer as a rock star. So
Yeah.
even if you weren't into them, you knew who Freddy Krueger was.
Yeah, it was on
You
trading cards. It
you
was on
knew five
lunchboxes.
you knew five kids that went for him as Halloween, any given year. You knew who Jason was, and then when I was in junior high, going into high school, I just me and my friends just started renting a lot more horror movies, and it became like a Friday ritual for me and my friend Pete at the time, and we just started renting horror movies, and then we rented In the Mouth of Madness at a sleepover, and it's one of the reasons why those movie sleepovers were such a big
Yeah.
inspiration on me doing a podcast called Saturday Night Movie Sleepovers. And I just completely fell in love with In the Mouth of Madness. And
Was it
then,
around 96?
oh, that was it was probably when it was a new release, so it was probably like '94 maybe,
Gotcha.
because I think that movie came out in '93 or '94, so it was somewhere around '94.
Yeah.
Maybe '95, and then as I'm sure you can relate to, and a lot of people that would listen to a movie podcast, once the obsessive like collector, you
Yep.
know, so it was,
Gotta watch them all.
I have to figure out who this guy is. And then it was like, oh, he directed a lot of movies that I love, and I never even put two and two together, like Big Trouble in Little China and Escape from New York
Yeah.
and They Live and
Christine. So
Christine
many.
was a big movie for me as a kid, and so it was. I just became obsessed with John Carpenter, and then when I got into and the music, In the Mouth of
Yeah.
Madness was probably the first horror movie score that I ever bought,
Yeah.
like on CD. Like we had stuff. My dad had Jaws, on record, but like the first horror movie soundtrack that I ever bought was probably In the Mouth of Madness, and then probably Halloween. So I just got way into John Carpenter, and then when I got to film school, and I went to film school for college, and then the benefit of that is that you get to meet a bunch of like-minded people, because this is before Twitter
Right.
and Facebook and those
When you can
things.
just meet anybody across the world. Yeah.
Yeah, this was a very intense film program. There was like 18 of us. And
Oh,
so
cool.
you for the first time you're in a room with other people that are totally obsessed with cinema. And so then you start talking about what you're into, and then you start watching movies together, and you start getting introduced to things that you didn't see, and you start introducing other people to things that they hadn't seen. And it was there that I fully I loved horror and was into horror, but it was at that time that I became obsessed with like learning about horror.
Yeah, like learning the director mindset, like what it takes to
Yeah.
actually produce a film, where they come from, the structure of how they're written, just all like the
Yeah.
technical basics.
Sure, and even from a historical
Sure.
standpoint, like knowing, building a library of references of movies or VHS tapes at that time, and so
Stuff
it
that like influenced Hitchcock, and stuff that even went back to early days when we're talking about like Vampire and
oh sure, yeah.
20s era, international, everything else. Yeah, I mean, you when you start studying cinema like that and you focus on a specific genre, it just opens up just decades and decades, going all the way back to when, the technology was first formed.
Yeah. And, I think for me, looking back on it, it was a little bit of a rebellious thing, I think.
Oh, yeah.
I was going to a very arty film school, the same film school that people like Hal Hartley went to. And so it was, you know, I think it was a little bit of a rebellion. It was like, yeah, all that stuff's cool, but John
Sure.
Carpenter, you know? And, you know, at the time,
Rabotin.
I always,
Yeah.
I always call it a bit of a perfect storm too, because it was like I was there at that time meeting those people who were introducing me to things I haven't seen. I was going to school like a half hour outside of New York City. So at that time, you know, there were a bunch of video stores you could go to in New York and buy cheap movies. Joe Bob Briggs is now on again, but he was on then, and
Literally right now watching Chud with everybody on Shudder for The Last Drive-In. It's great. I love it.
But at that time, I didn't grow up with cable. My dad had it, but my mom didn't have it. So when I got to college and we had cable like on campus, me and some of the guys from the Pink Smoke website went to film school together, and we just
that's badass.
Those
guys are great.
And we just fell in love with Joe Bob Briggs and watching movies together. And people like Chris Funderburg had seen Suspiria, but he hadn't seen the other Argento movies, and so then he and I, and in a lot of cases also John Cribbs, we kind of started to rediscover all this Argento stuff. And then companies like Anchor Bay were releasing for the first time like remastered widescreen VHS tapes, but still movies that were, you know, not lost, but not easy to find for the
like
first time.
Like Fulci's Zombie. I remember getting that tape, and it was great.
Yeah,
I loved Anchor Bay in the late 90s and early 2000s. The rollout that they had was fantastic.
But it was just like the perfect moment to fall in love with horror movies. And that's when I fell in love with Argento, was like my freshman year of film school. So like 97 is when that started. This love affair.
Well, it's funny for me. Like I started, you know, as I got older into my late teens, around the mid late 90s, going more from just specific films to directors to cast and crew, and you know, like you're talking about with music and growing into that, I would start looking at composers, and like you mentioned, Vangelis, I found out who, you know, did the music for Blade Runner and had to go out and buy the CD. Got the CD for In the Mouth of Madness as well, and absolutely fucking loved listening to the dark ambient drone work while the lights were off on my headphones, because that soundtrack is amazing, and I want to see it put back in print if ever. But I had this talk with you just a little bit before we started recording that your first, or one of your first experiences with Argento was also one of mine, which was through working with George Romero and releasing Two Evil Eyes.
Yeah.
And that's a film that, you know, I remember watching really young when it was on Cinemax and being semi-traumatized by it, and growing up and eventually realizing, oh, he worked with one of my favorite directors because of that. Creep Show, Dawn of the Dead. I want to know more. So, of course, getting into Suspiria, that's the one that, you know, even then everyone would go to. Yeah. But then Tenebrae, and then Phenomena, which in the States for a while was called Creepers. But, you know, it just opened up like that.
Yeah. You know, I was thinking about it earlier because I think the order in which I saw Argento's movies is probably very different than the order that people would watch them now.
Okay.
You know, like I think most people would see Suspiria first.
Yeah.
But, you know,
I think that's the common.
We kind of, you know, like I got into him at a time when you couldn't get a lot of his movies, you know, and some of them, they were starting to come out. Suspiria had come out on VHS, and, so in a way, it's like how I was fed them. The order in which I was fed them was just dictated by how I could get my hands on it. You know, like
whatever tape was on the shelf.
Yeah, or you know, going to a horror convention at the New Yorker Hotel in Manhattan and buying, you know, bootlegs of Japanese laser discs of Stendhal Syndrome and Four Flies on Grey Velvet, and you know, it was.
Plumage and whatever you could get.
Yeah, so like I saw Two Evil Eyes first, because that was what my video store had, and I
Mm-hmm.
remember Chris Funderburg came home with me for Christmas break to my mom's house, and we went to Captain Video in Cohoes, New York.
Cool.
Rest
Very
in peace,
cool.
rest in peace, Captain Video.
I
and
love it.
and that was on the. We were looking for stuff to rent, and that was on the shelf, and we were like, oh, George Romero, and he was like, oh, the other guy is the guy that directed this movie Suspiria,
Mm-hmm.
because he had seen Suspiria was the only one he had seen, and so we rented that, and it just kind of like blew my mind. And then I think I found for like $3 at Coconut Records the American cut of Opera, Terror at the Opera.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that was probably my second Argento movie that I saw. And then probably Suspiria and Deep Red, right? Whichever order, like then I saw those, and
Mm-hmm.
then the rest of them were just hard to find at that time. So then it was my buddy who I do Saturday Night Movie Sleepovers with, Dion. He lived up in the New Haven, Connecticut area, and I would often go to his place because he was my roommate freshman year
Mm-hmm.
of the film school, and they had a great video store there called Best Video where they had weird shit like that. So we would then I got into Argento, and then we would go up there and we would rent like Fulci and Argento
Yeah.
movies, and then across the Tappan Zee Bridge from where I went to school in Piermont was like the greatest video store of all time, Piermont Video, and they
Hmm.
had just like
Everything you could think of, pretty much.
We rented Cannibal Holocaust like a
Oh my
decade
god.
before you could get it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Before DVDs weren't didn't come out for another couple of years, and
And these weren't PAL tapes. These were like licensed tapes that they just managed to do deep dives on and find
I
from
think
distribution companies or
yeah, and I think some of these video stores would carry some bootlegs.
yeah.
Maybe.
Well, gotta do what you can, and if there's the agreement there between the folks running it and the customer, there you go.
And, so
That's great.
so my path through Argento, I think, was atypical from what people would do now, because now
Yeah.
everything's a click away.
Well, everything's accessible, everything's ranked. So you get people who are now looking for these movies because they've heard of Argento or they've heard of Aja or, they've heard somebody talking about Suspiria because they watched Juno the other night or whatever.
Yeah.
And then they go on to a different, buzz site. Okay, top 10 Argento ranked. And they're like, all right, I'll start from the top and work my way down. But it's interesting when you're still trying to do that kind of treasure hunting thing to see what path you wind up going down. But I think by the time I had maybe seen either Suspiria or Tenebrae, I started really wanting to know more. And this was kind of early with the advent of DVD and commentaries and people getting hired on. Like a perfect example, the new excellent Blu-ray of Phenomena from I think Synapse
Yeah.
has a commentary on it from someone who wrote an entire book about Argento syndrome, and it's amazing. It's a fantastic listen. But when I dug in, I was like, who is Dario Argento? Where is he coming from? Is he completely original? Is he influenced by anybody? What all has he done? And it just kind of opened up to all this study. Like somebody would study Hitchcock or Kubrick.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, but I want to get your take on it when you started really like trying to find out who Dario Argento was as a creator or in a filmmaker.
I don't. I mean, I don't really know. I mean, I don't. In a way, I'm not sure there was a huge conscious decision.
Hmm.
I definitely was.
All the info just started funneling in.
Well,
The more you watched, the more you got.
I mean, it was first and foremost was to try to find the movies,
Sure.
and then I'm trying to think of even how we discovered stuff. I mean, I guess Broken Mirrors, Broken Minds, or that was out, but that had been released, and I picked that up.
Did you ever see the World of Argento documentary that Michele Soavi had done around
Oh
the
yeah,
time that
yeah. I had seen
Phenomena was
that.
made?
I think I had rented that from one of those video stores or got that as a bootleg from a convention or something at the time.
Yeah.
Definitely had seen, yeah. I mean, I'm just trying to think of like really what was it? I know it was, at that time you're 19, 18, 19, 20. I mean, you're a sponge.
Yeah.
It's really, and I talk to people via Twitter that are like 19 now, and I'd be like, you have no idea that the movies that you fall in love with right now are going to be the movies that shape the rest of your life.
Oh, for sure.
you know,
They're the ones that become the pursuits. Like, it's around that time that you're like, all right, who do I want to grow up to be?
yeah,
Do I want to try to go down the path of Ramiro? Do I want to try to make movies like Argento or Carpenter or, Suave or whoever else?
yeah.
And
It's like at that age, you're never going to be influenced and you're never going to love a movie in that way again.
Sure.
Like I could fall in love with a movie now, but it's a different kind of love. I mean, that back then it's a very intense puppy love. It's a very intense, immature. You got these movie hormones going. You don't really know what to do with them, and it's very intense. It's like Arnie and Christine. You get this obsessive,
Yep.
and it was just I taught a class on horror movies at SUNY Purchase, which is where I went to school a couple years after I had graduated. I taught it for 3 years, and I would show Suspiria in class, and I would tell them ahead of time, warning them, because it wasn't that class wasn't for film students. It was like a film history class for liberal arts students. I'm gonna say, like, look, some of you are gonna love this. You're gonna love it. Some of you are gonna not like it. I mean, there's not really too much in between. Like it's you're either going to connect with it on some level and it's really going to make an impression on you, or you're just not going to be into it. And if you're not into it, that's fine. But what I will say is, like, don't worry about things like narrative. Don't get don't 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 get caught up in like the traditional way of watching a movie.
Completely clear exposition.
It's
entirely direct plot.
it's a visceral
coherence.
experience. I would say it's a visceral experience, and like let the movie wash over you. And if it and when it's done, if you dig it, awesome, and if you don't, that's fine. I feel like I don't know what it is about Argento's movies that I love so much, or what struck me when I first saw them. I just know that it did.
Yeah.
You
Which was the first one that fascinated you? Which was the one that captivated you the most early on? Would you say?
Right out of the gate when I saw Two Evil Eyes. I mean, at the time, I've come to really love the Romero section. But at the time,
Well, I mean, Adrian Barbeau. Yeah, it's
but
Valdemar. It's a great story.
I also was a late comer to Romero.
Gotcha.
I didn't grow up with Creep Show.
Yeah. That was my side. I grew up with Creep Show, and then watched more of Romero's stuff, and I think I even saw Night Riders early. So
I mean, his half of Two Evil Eyes is very much could be another episode of Creep Show.
Oh, sure.
It's got Creep Show people in it. It's a little vignette. It feels very much like Creep Show. And so if I had been a huge Creep Show fan at that point, I probably would have felt very different about it. But
yeah, Tom Adkins, so great.
The Argento's The Black Cat was just like, Harvey Keitel's performance is like off the wall. Like
it's an
clearly drunk through
angry.
A lot of it for in real life. He's clearly shit faced through some of that movie, and
drinking whatever whiskey it is that he's just screaming over, yelling about the cat,
and some of Savini's
so good.
Some of Savini's like most realistic work, I think.
Oh, that pendulum
set?
Oh my god.
Or just like when Harvey Keitel is stabbing at his girlfriend or his wife, and she puts her hand up.
Yeah.
And when he's trying to photograph that cat and he starts being mean to the cat, it's like they're hurting a cat in this movie. Like you felt unsafe in this.
The disclaimer as soon as the credits come up is No animals harmed at all.
but
Everything's fine.
but
But you would think because of the content of that story, that should be at the front just to make people okay.
but
It's heavy. I
there was a
mean,
sense that you were not safe in the hands of this filmmaker.
yeah,
Like
danger.
you
Oh
couldn't
yeah.
trust him. And I think that was very tantalizing for me at like age 18 when I saw it.
Yeah.
And so it was like right off the bat, I was like, oh my God, like this is crazy. And then just working my way through his catalog, I fell in love with Deep Red, probably even more so than Suspiria.
Really?
And to this day, I probably still like it better than more than Suspiria. And Inferno, Inferno
Yeah.
rocked my world. Inferno is very well could be my favorite Argento movie. And I had right before I went, actually, like days before I went to see Goblet in 2013, I interviewed Alan Jones. It's the guy who wrote Profundo Argento.
I know the book. I can't remember. I think that sounds right. But yeah, yeah, yeah. How was your talk with him?
It was great, and we talked. It was fun to talk to a fellow, obsessed Argento fan, and he had
Sure.
been it is Alan Jones, and he had been
Yeah.
like a writer for Cinema Fantastique magazine forever, and so he actually had visited the set of every Argento movie, starting with Tenebrae,
Yeah.
and interviewed
Yeah,
people, and so he was friends with Argento, and he talking to him was great. And at the time, I would imagine it might still be the case because it wasn't that long ago, Inferno was also his favorite Argento movie. So it was just fun to then talk to somebody else that also loved Inferno as much as I did.
Speaking of terrible scenes with cats again, in that bit in Inferno, my God.
I always say to me, Inferno feels like Suspiria was like the dry run. It was like the dress rehearsal for what he was trying to do, like visually.
Yeah,
And then
especially that dreamlike tone. Like, I can watch Inferno just in a haze, and all the way up until the reveal of, Mater Tenebrarum. I mean, it's just amazing.
Oh, I fully admit that. I mean, it very quickly became a movie that I absolutely loved.
Sure.
I would say it was my favorite Argento movie, but I fully admit that it took me like 3 years of constant viewing to realize that there was more than one female character in that movie.
It demands rewatches, that's for sure.
I was like, wait, she goes into a hole and now she's over here, and it was like, oh, they're different actors. These are different characters. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, as soon as you dive into
this was
underwater villa with the sister, you're in a world that's just not, structured the way that normally anything is. But it's interesting you mentioned Profundo Rosso, as being a favorite too, because that's a pretty straight, singular, like, not too strange of a plot, except for a little bit of surrealism, kind of murder mystery giallo. It's got a real direct, easy to dig into kind of narrative compared to a lot of his other stuff, especially after he stopped getting funding from his dad.
Oh yeah, I mean totally. And then of course there's this term called giallo. What is that?
Yeah.
Like, what does that refer to? And then it's the going down that alley.
Yeah. What's the whole thing about the black gloved killer?
I will say in my defense about not understanding that there were more than one actress in Inferno, you have to. In my defense, it was a grainy VHS tape.
Yeah.
Watched on a very small television.
I love how nowadays, just because of the clarity of every transfer that's being released every year, there's no more excuses for bad resolution or fuzzy TVs or any of that stuff, especially when it comes to one like Tenebrae that was just chopped to shit when it was being shopped around to video stores.
Yeah, yeah. And then,
Such a great film.
Yeah, and then, I saw that. I don't know, like, I would still put him, like, solidly in my top 3 favorite filmmakers. There's just something about his movies that, and like I said, in a way, I don't even really know what it is, but they just they speak to me on some level, and I don't know. I just like connect with them. I appreciate them in a way. I tend to, I tend to appreciate things in the ones that even nobody likes.
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
know,
I'm sure you've got like something that you loved from the card player.
yeah,
Or I've
it's
even heard you talk about Dracula where you've said Argento doesn't give a fuck what you think about Dracula. Which I was listening to Claudio Simonetti's score, the Dracula suite today, in one of his newer releases. I think it was off Blood Anthology, and it's great. I do love aspects of Dracula 3D, but I can totally see him just being like, no, I was having fun. I got Aja lit on fire, and I brought in Rutger Hauer. It was a great time.
yeah. I mean, he took a weird path there for a while, where he did Phantom of the Opera. He did a version of Phantom of the Opera, and and then he kind of swung back around and did Sleepless, and he's just, I don't know. He's just he's very unique. When you talk about like the auteur theory of like a movie having a specific author,
Yeah,
horror seems to be a place that you can point to, and have some of the most prime examples of that.
absolutely.
Carpenter is obviously one, Romero, and Argento. I mean, there's no
Yeah.
other filmmaker that does what he does. He has a very specific thing. And one of the things that I find amazing is that with his first feature, Bird with Crystal Plumage, it's so
Right.
fully realized
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
a debut. Like, other than maybe Sam Raimi, I can't think of somebody else whose first movie is so fully realized of like, this is like such a great like like representation of what their style is, what they're going to be known for the rest of their career.
Totally, totally. Well, it's funny talking about the auteur theory and talking about some of these films that are out there as the first feature that they knock out. There's also the background. I was thinking a little bit about Don Coscarelli because of Phantasm. Before Phantasm, he'd done a couple of other pictures that were not successful, but Phantasm being the breakout for him in horror is just this realized, film that immediately became a cult classic and one that I've loved since growing up. And then, also looking at Jordan Peele right now, with his background, what he's done, getting Get Out there, and then doing Us, we've got that in, this time when horror has been kind of, I don't know, some people have said maybe homogenized or created into this sort of cookie cutter format where whatever works, that's going to be the next wave of movies for the next 10 years, even though you go back to different eras. And there was a slasher era, there was the 70s era, and before that. But I think what's fascinating to me about Argento is that he had started off as a critic and a journalist and a writer. And then he had started working through his dad, meeting up with other folks like Sergio Leone and doing work on Once Upon a Time in the West. And then doing all these other films. And then eventually Plumage gets made. And it's gone down as one of the greatest definitive examples of that specific time and genre in history. A lot of people call it a masterpiece.
Oh, sure. Well, the idea of like the critic turned auteur, it's a very European kind of notion. I mean, Truffaut and Godard were critics,
It's alluring. I mean, it's just like, oh my God, they can do that and make it happen in France and Italy. That's amazing.
It doesn't hurt that he comes from a filmmaking family, obviously. But then there are people that might have that kind of privilege and not be able to do with it what Argento was able to do with it. He's clearly had a very specific vision. There's the whole thing with Giallo. It's interesting because like he kept on I'm not going to say reinventing it, but he kept on like rejuvenizing it.
Sure.
It kind of, Mario Bava had kind of started it in film,
Hmm.
and then it kind of started to wane a little bit, and then he comes out with Bird with Crystal Plumage, Argento, and then it's a huge success, and nobody is better at exploiting another person's success than Italy. when it
If we want to go down the rabbit hole of Mad Max ripoffs, I'm more than happy to.
when it
So
when it when it comes to filmmaking anyway.
I love it. Oh, all the Alien ripoffs.
And so
Amazing.
then
But yeah.
when everybody's doing some animal titled Giallo movie, he's like, I don't want to do Giallo anymore. I'm going to do this crazy 5 days in Milan, completely opposite of the spectrum. I don't want to be associated with that anymore. Oh wait, that wasn't successful. Okay, I'll do another Giallo movie.
Let me do Cat of Nine Tails. Get that one out there. Let me do Four Flies on Grey Velvet.
And then he comes out with Deep Red, which is again, kind of completely another like shot of adrenaline into this idea of like the Italian giallo mystery murder thriller.
A massive success. Very Hitchcock influenced with a lot of Bob influence, and just it seems like he was one of those kinds of creators who just knew how to cull all the right influences to make the best final product and use the right people, because he would always load his cast and crew with people who were really eager to make the best final product possible.
Yeah, and I'd also say in terms of influences though, like none of his stuff ever, at least to me, feels like
aped.
too on the nose or something. It's something about having the ability to take those influences and like put them through the Argento filter of like his thing that makes them feel very different. When I interviewed Alan Jones, I was asking him like, basically I was asking him in his opinion, or did he know if Argento knew, like, was Hitchcock influenced by Argento with something like Frenzy? Because it's a very it's very British, but it's also very Italian in a lot. It's a British giallo. And some of those Argento movies are. He's like, and Alan had a great point of view. He's like, look, if you heard that there was this young guy being hailed as the next Hitchcock, the next the Italian Hitchcock, and you loved movies, wouldn't you go see his movies?
Yeah. I mean, that even kind of comes full circle when he eventually releases Do You Like Hitchcock?
Yeah, totally.
Which is just such an on-the-nose joke for a title. I see the humor in his work too. I mean, he's definitely an interesting creator, very inventive, which even goes down to the technical level. I mean, he has a real love and affection for cinema.
Oh yeah, totally. I would love to talk to him about other people's movies. Like, I would love to know.
I'd imagine that'd be great.
I would love to know like what Argento feels about like Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Oh, or even like Ingmar Bergman, that'd be amazing.
I always had this idea where I wanted to create, how back when reality shows were more like a real world type situation, like putting people in a house together. I was like, how great would a show be where it's Argento and Werner Herzog stuck in a house together for like... Like, wouldn't that be the most amazing television show ever? I would imagine it would end with Argento trying to stab Herzog while Herzog tries to,
shoot him,
strangle or shoot Argento.
My best fiend Dario, be so good. Yeah, it's really interesting to me, especially like looking at a documentary about Argento, like World of Argento, that Soavi did, which Argento commissioned him to, where he really does have that FaceTime in front of the camera, and he's talking about what he thinks about sex and death and art, and it's I guess just the right kind of upbringing and influence in literature, and having amazing artwork around all the time. And it just fascinates me that, the films that he's put out are the kind of films that they are. But I know we were going to talk a lot about, phenomena specifically, and we've been kind of getting in and out of a few different films. But how would you rank the different eras of Argento just on an entertainment level? Do you think his earliest stuff is the best? Do you think his years with Dario Argento are the best? Do you think his later stuff after opera are even fun? What do you think about overall?
As someone who like genuinely loves the vast majority of his work, it's a hard question to answer. But I would say that his strongest period, in my personal opinion, and I wouldn't have put it this way until you said it, I would say are the Dario Argento years, like Profondo Rosso
To opera.
through like Phenomena, are like,
Yeah.
that's like the golden age of Argento. That's kind of those would be the ones. For me, those would be the ones if somebody was like, "What should I watch?" I would pick movies from that period to be like,
Yeah.
these are the ones you should look at. And then if you like those, then
Watch the
branch
first
out.
five, and
then branch
go
out
after.
a little bit,
Yeah.
But because like, look, if you don't like Suspiria and The Deep Red, you're not going to like the rest of them. I mean, if those two movies don't. If you just don't connect with those movies, in my opinion, there's no sense in going any further because, one, I'm not sure it gets better than that, and two, those movies so clearly demonstrate like his sensibility that if you're not in tune with that, then you'd very likely just be wasting your time to go further.
Well, it's funny for me because Deborah was going to be on the show, but she had to work late, so we were unable to have her join us for the conversation. She might actually counter you with that, in that she does not want to watch Suspiria. She's made a couple of attempts to see it. We went to a event a while back where they were doing a double feature, and first off, it was this big Halloween party, and then they put on Phantom of the Paradise, and then afterwards they put on Suspiria, and it was just a wash. Too many people running around, too drunk, having fun, and
Jessica Harper double feature.
yeah, exactly. It's great. I was more than happy to be a part of that. It's amazing. See her dance in the first one and dance in the second one. It's too much fun. But yeah, and with Inferno, she's a big fan. So we've got one of the Mother trilogy. She hasn't seen Mother of Tears yet, but when she watched Phenomena, that immediately became a favorite. Also, I think because of Jennifer Connelly.
Yeah.
Having done that directly before she did Labyrinth. And then Tenebrae, which is a pretty cut and dry, despite the fact that there are multiple killers.
Sure.
Murder mystery about, an author, which almost seems a little bit Stephen King-like. So...
Well, it's also it's the plot of Basic Instinct. I mean, it's...
Oh, totally. Different people can have different, leads into these films. And then sometimes people can just, like you were talking about, being a little, not necessarily contrarian, but a little rebellious to overblown, pop culture and popularity.
Yeah.
Just because so many people won't shut up about Suspiria, which can kind of be a double-edged sword.
Yeah, Tenebrae and Phenomenon, they're also so very close in style. There's something about them. They have a very similar feel. It's the idea of like, I don't know. They just, something about them just feels. I mean, I think they're a lot. Obviously, they're a lot less lavish in colors than Inferno and Suspiria were, and there is a very particular early 80s feel to them, but not like an American early 80s, not what you would imagine, like,
something like The Burning or
yeah, so
whatever came out around that time. Yeah.
There's this certain feel to them that to me separates those two movies from the rest of the batch. They're almost, and they're always released together. Like Synapse put out Tenebrae and Phenomena kind of
Yep.
back to back, and back in the day, Anchor Bay put them out kind of back to back on VHS. I mean, they must be owned. Whoever owns
They're an
those
odd pair.
movies, they must have, they must be the same people, because I think they are. Those two movies I think came out back to back. So, for me, those two movies are linked. So it's in a way funny, but also not surprising that they would be connected in kind of what you're talking about too.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
in
We're the certain
interest.
kind of person with a certain mindset and perspective on Argento or what people talk about as work might just be like, I'm going to give those two a shot and then be blown away by them.
Yeah, yeah.
And I also think it's funny too that Phenomena led to getting Demons made because Phenomena had gone so far over budget that Argento needed to get a film out any other way he could. So he produced this just so it could get into the theaters quick and make a shitload of money to pay for the rest of Phenomena,
Yeah.
which is such a great business model to do it. This is my dream. This is, my huge effort. I've run out of money. Let's just do a really quick single location monster movie in a theater and get it out.
Yeah.
And it's fun. It's a ton of fun. But yeah, I think, all these films are fascinating. I think what went on behind the scenes is especially interesting. But I don't know. What do you want to talk about next? Do you want to talk about a specific movie? Do you want to talk about a little history? Do you want to talk about some conflict? Because when it got to, Phenomena and Opera, his home life was getting pretty rough.
Yeah, look, they're Italian. They're very
Sure.
very passionate people.
Passionate.
I too am from Italian lineage. I know
Yeah.
very very passionate. I think that all kind of started with Suspiria.
Which Dario wrote.
Yeah, yeah.
Which I think is fascinating because he was at that point making movies and saying, I don't want to make a movie unless I write it.
yeah. Well, women will
That's how it goes.
women will make you do a lot of things when you're in love, and I'm sure guys too. Love is a
Sure.
it's a very crazy thing. But I think where it started was that he very freely took credit for more of Suspiria than I think Dario Nicolodi thought he should. I mean, I know that even in interviews at the time, he was telling her story as his story, and that he was saying his grandmother was the one that went to a music academy that was front for black magic. And
Oh, that's dirty.
when he took that story from her, because it was her grandmother and it was her, and that's what influenced her to make this story with him, among many other things, like the De Quincey Suspiria story and all that stuff. But she's been quoted as saying, like, when he did that, I never forgave him for that, and that was kind of the beginning, I think, of the end. And then these people say that you can kind of see the arc of their relationship through the way he treats her in movies.
Him beating her up more and more, and then her at the end of Phenomena, and then her getting brains blown out in Opera.
Yeah.
Which I think it was between me, her, and Bradley J. Cornish, a conversation about that scene in Opera when she's looking through the peephole. And she has the squib little, explosive on the back of her hair, and she gets her headshot through her eye, that she really loved how much care Michael Soavi gave to her for that effect, because it was so dangerous.
Yeah.
And, there have been times when, like, Argento is kind of beaten up on his family. Like, if we're talking about Fiora Argento in the beginning of Phenomena, she was running around with all these wind fans going on and going to that area where her head goes through the glass. and there was some danger there, and it was a little extreme, it seemed like. And she kind of, from there, he had been grooming her to try to, be a bit of an actress. He had a big part for her in Demons, but she seemed to never really want to get back into it after that.
Well,
Yeah,
when your dad
suffer for the art.
when your dad treats you like that, she talks about how in that scene, one, that even though it was sugar glass, I mean, it was still painful, and that, her dad would, when she was trying to do those scenes, like all of a sudden she would be in the middle of it, and then she'd feel somebody like firmly grab her legs, like her ankles, and it was like her dad under the camera, like shaking her and stuff. And even if you go ahead, some of the at the very least some of the treatment of the characters in which Asia has played, I don't really know what to say about it. I mean, Argento is the one of my favorite things is Argento related is in the documentary An Eye for Horror, and there's an interview with Asia, and she's talking about how it's during a section where they're talking about Argento being labeled like a misogynist filmmaker, and it's
violence against women, and
it's presenting this argument. Well, like there are a lot of his movies that have female protagonists and yada yada yada, and then and she's like, well, Asia's like, well, I think a lot of it has to do with his relationship with his mother, and then she says like, and I don't know what my grandmother did to him. But
well, the background is that Argento's mom was a famous photographer, and that's why everyone is like, hey, no matter what it is to a woman on screen, you can never say he didn't shoot it well.
Yeah. And she's like,
he did make them look beautiful.
Or his grandmother, but she's like, I don't know what. I mean, it was I don't know what his grandmother did to him, but she was always very afraid of him. Something. It's like there's she comes up with these weird peeks into like through the keyhole of like Argento's life, and then she either backpedals or just never goes deeper, and it's just like this little like tantalizing morsel of like, wait, what?
It's like talking to David Lynch. Could you expand on that? No.
I mean, he was supposedly pretty sickly as a child, and that's how he kind of fell in love with horror, by raiding his father's library and falling in love with Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft, and
clear love for Poe and Lovecraft throughout a lot of his work.
Yeah. So I mean, I just think it's I think he had a kind of an atypical growing up. I mean, his dad was in the film business. Asia talks about how like a lot of her rebellion came out of trying to get his attention because he was kind of absent for most of her life. Even probably the reason why she tried to be an actress for him was to be a part of
connection.
Be part of his world. And I'm sure he probably felt that way too. Having his dad be in the movie business and his mom being a well-known photographer, there was probably a disconnect there, and probably a lot of his love for cinema probably came out of that same place.
Solitude too, because when you have people in your family who are that active and you're not of an age when you can always be around for that, you might just be sick at home raiding the library for Edgar Allan Poe books.
Yeah.
That's something I'm certainly familiar with. But I do want to ask you what you think happened when he tried to break out in the States, because he had two movies, and one of them for me is a favorite, although it's extremely flawed. Trauma.
Yeah.
Because it never gets talked about nearly enough, but it seemed like it had a fantastic story, a great cast, a great supporting cast, him at the helm, and leads by Piper Laurie and Brad Dourif. And how can you go wrong with that at that time? It just seems like it all should have been his big, presentation to get the States excited, aside from Dawn of the Dead.
I mean, the only thing I can imagine is what happens, I think, to a lot of foreign filmmakers is that I think Hollywood or the American film industry sees somebody with talent, sees somebody with
Hmm.
success, and says, "We want you to come here and do what you do here."
Yeah.
And then when they come to do that, they're like, no, like don't do what you do." you know?
Do what got you successful and bring that potential to our studio so we can get that money too.
Yeah, I
Oh
think there's this
no.
weird thing that happens where the, the idea of come here and do what you do, and then not fully realizing what that is, and
Yeah.
then not being brave enough to let somebody do that.
Hmm.
With that said, I love Trauma, and part
Yeah.
of what I was saying before about how me, discovering Argento films in kind of probably what is now an atypical order probably goes to some of my affection for a lot of these movies that are lesser known, because I just happened to see them before some of the bigger ones, and
Yeah.
so, those things like Two Evil Eyes and Trauma, like those are some of those are the movies that got me excited about Argento enough to pursue the other stuff.
Hmm.
So like I just love Trauma. Like I love it as much as most of his other stuff. To me, that's like if you're split up in teams, like you got the A team. For me, Trauma
Hmm.
is solid B team in my opinion. Like I just love that
I'm
movie.
with you.
I mean, I don't even you're saying it's heavily flawed. I don't even see it. And to me, it's perfection. Other than that, the crazy, reggae end credit sequence, which is just completely
Yeah.
bizarre. The rest of it's like, what more could? Like, I mean, I don't know if it's that it just doesn't get a lot of love, or just a lot of people
Hmm.
don't see it.
Yeah.
I don't know which one, because like I can't imagine.
It's just not readily available.
And I mean,
There's that Anchor Bay DVD out there, but
which
nobody
is crazy because it's one of the
looks
only
out for it.
American movies.
Yeah, yeah, but I think a lot of people's criticism of it was the perceived fetishism of anorexia, putting Aja in an underage romantic relationship, and then I've seen so many complaints against the performances. And there was also something that I wanted to ask you about if you've heard about this, because I heard about it way back, that Brad Dourif hated being on set for it for whatever reason, whether it was some conflicting issue with Argento or his direction or what. But for me, this is like a solid. I don't know if you want to give it a number rating, 4 out of 5, 8 out of 10 kind of thing. I just think if it had just a couple of changes in the direction of the cast and maybe a couple of adjustments to pacing, it would be easy top 3.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just, opinion, also about how I subjectively as well as am objectively looking at the film, just on, technical levels.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it does. It doesn't.
It's a blast. Don't get me wrong. I love the fact that it's got a million decapitations and one of the funnest payoffs
Yeah, well,
of any of his
it's
films
got
at the end. My
it's got
God,
the most fucked up thing
it's so
in
dark.
all of
It's
Argento's filmography.
just, and I don't want to spoil it for anybody,
Yeah,
but when you get to that scene, it just hits and it's unbelievable. It's such a punch in the gut.
I
I love it.
remember I received that movie on VHS
Hmm.
from the Pink Smoke guys. Chris Funderburg and John Cribbs gave me a copy of that for my birthday in
Oh, it's great.
1998,
Hmm.
and I remember they're like, I think they watched it because it was a used tape, and then they
Sure.
gave it to me, and they're like, and like, Asia's boobs are in it, and like, how fucked up is that? And to me at the time, I was like, I don't know, like they have nude beaches there. Maybe it's not a big deal.
Hmm.
Like maybe like nudity is not a big deal in Italy. But
Right.
but then you hear Asia talk about like how difficult doing that was, and I'm like, oh, that's a shame. Like
Yeah.
that kind of takes a little bit of the wind out of the sails of that movie for me. But at the time, I was like, I don't know. They do like people go to the beach nude there. Like there are topless beaches in Italy. Maybe boobs aren't a big deal there like they are here.
No, totally. I'm with you, and I think that people who look at Argento, especially now, have the latter half of his career to kind of mock without perspective and just shit on just because it might be either they don't get it or it doesn't meet the needs that they want after watching something like Suspiria. But when you look at his overall work, it's a fascinating filmography. It's a fascinating body of work, and I don't know. Do you think there's anything coming next?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think so.
You think he's
I
done?
think he's done. I mean, he's had
Yeah.
allegedly had some medical issues. I mean, he's in his 70s
Mm,
now.
yeah.
I got to, a couple of months ago when Claudio Simonetti was touring with
Hmm.
his version of Goblin.
Yeah.
We got
Claudio Simonetti's Goblin.
we got to
I
meet up.
love that.
I got to meet up with him and hang out with him a bit. Got to go to sound checks and stuff like that, which was very cool. Because even though I had talked to him for my book, we had never met in person. So it was fun to finally get to meet him in person and get to spend a little bit of time, FaceTime with him and chat. And he said, "Look, he's like, I don't know." I said, "I don't." His opinion was he'd be very surprised if Argento does another one. But apparently he's doing
Yeah.
some kind of thing for Netflix now. Some
Well,
like
if he
anthology
wants to
thing or
produce, he's bringing that TV idea that he had that broke everybody up in the late '70s, early '80s to the states now.
well, he's had TV stuff going on, throughout his career, and it's one of the
Hmm.
reasons why he was labeled with that Hitchcock kind of Italian Hitchcock moniker, because Hitchcock was like not just the filmmaker but like the face of those movies. And
Yeah.
the thing that I don't think a lot of people realize about Argento in terms of American fans is like
Hmm.
how famous he is there.
Oh, he was crazy famous
Like
in his country
he gets,
to an
he,
extreme level.
he goes on like sports shows to talk about football, soccer,
Hmm.
like
Yeah.
he's a like a bona fide celebrity personality. And
I would say almost to the level of royalty to a degree
yeah,
in the entertainment world
and
for sure.
and it's funny because you always hear how big he is over there. At least in the late '90s, I'd always hear about how big
Hmm.
he was overseas, and you always wonder like, well, what does that mean exactly
Yeah.
to be to be making those kind of movies? Because even aside from someone like Hitchcock, we never had anybody here in America rise to that kind of fame that made
Maybe Spielberg. I
that made
mean,
horror movies, that was known as a horror movie
yeah.
filmmaker. Yes, Spielberg, but Spielberg, was doing, yeah, he did some horror movies, but he was known for making,
Family Fare,
yeah.
for sure.
So every time throughout the decades afterwards, every time I met somebody that was from Italy, Italian from
Hmm.
Italy, I'd say, what, like, what about Dario Argento? And they'd be like, oh. They'd be like, what? I'd be like, well, like, how? I hear he's big there. How big is he there? And they'd all say he's Spielberg. He's the Italian
Yeah.
Spielberg. Like, that's how big he is there.
His face might as well be printed on money.
Uh,
He's the face of an industry.
and one of them, first guy was like, well, he's not that big, but everybody knows
Are
who
you
he is.
You're talking to Luigi Cozzi or someone? I mean, that's great.
Yeah.
That's too funny.
They're like, oh, well, he's not really, he's not really that big, but everybody knows who he is and has seen all his movies. And I was like, oh, well, then he is big. What are you talking about? And they all love Deep Red. Like,
Yeah.
that's the movie. Like,
That's the one?
Like, here's Suspiria, and I think in Japan, Suspiria is the Argento movie. But I think in
Yeah.
most other places, especially the European countries, Deep Red is really like the Argento movie for like them.
And it's a great Christmas movie, too.
Fun for the whole family.
Always, yeah, perfect to put on during the holidays. Blake, it's been awesome talking to you. I've had a great time chatting with you about Argento, talking about his filmography and talking about your work. Thank you for being on the show. I wanted to ask you, is there anything you'd like to end on about Score to Death or Saturday Night Sleepovers or anything else you got going on or coming up?
Well, we're coming up on our 5th year, so we're like 4.5, a little more than 4.5 years into Saturday Night Movie Sleepovers. If you're a
Yeah.
film fan, we have a good time over there. I like to say it's fun and informative. Um, the the most consistent compliment, I'll call it a compliment that we get, and it's the best compliment I feel like we could ever get, is that people say it's like sitting around and talking about movies with your friends, which was exactly the vibe we were going for. So the fact that people unprompted come to us and say that is like the greatest thing ever.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's a lot of nostalgia. It's a lot of what you and I did tonight, which is talk about how we discovered movies, our love for specific movies, and then it's deep dives into the background of those movies, how they got made, sometimes some film theory stuff, or talking about script structure. But it's wherever the wind takes us, and we have fun, and we hope our listeners have fun too. Scored to Death, the podcast. There's back episodes that are available. Right now, it's on a little bit of a hiatus as I'm working on the book. But the other thing that's consistent is once a month, the last Saturday of every month, I'm doing a show for the Damn Fine Network called Cuts from the Crypt, where
Yeah.
I get to play kind of DJ for a day, but I play all horror movie music. And that's
Oh, hell yeah.
and that's been really fun because, who doesn't love making mixtapes? So I get to do like the ultimate, horror movie mixtape once a month for listeners, and kind of getting a feel for it, getting my feet, getting my land legs or my ship legs, or whatever you want to say. I'm getting used to it, and hopefully I'll start to be I try to inject a little bit of information in there too, and I have information to inject. But it's that's been a lot of fun, and I have a lot of fun doing that one. And other than that, I'm still trying to write. Other than just the book, I'm writing something right now for Scream magazine. That is going to
Cool.
be in
Hell yeah.
a future issue for them. And I just had liner notes for Cadaver Records' release of Pit and the Pendulum that just came out recently. So
Are we talking about the one that was it Stuart Gordon directed for Full Moon, or are we talking about a different?
no,
Pit in the Pendulum?
This is
The
a record.
Old Corman?
It's a record company called Cadaver Records that does kind of like books on record.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
And they have
hell yeah.
and they have people come and narrate these classic old horror stories, often abridged because you have to fit them on a record, and then they hire somebody to do an original score for it.
Yeah.
So-
almost like a radio play.
Yeah.
No, I love old CDs like those. I used to listen to those old K-Tel albums that would come out around Halloween in the early 90s that were all different Edgar Allan Poe stories, all other, anthologies mixed with score and Foley, and it was a blast. So that sounds super cool.
Yeah, that's been really interesting. I'm very proud of the notes that I did for the Pit and the Pendulum.
Nice.
I feel like it's some of my strongest writing. I think we're on those notes, and I also did notes for. They had like the guy from one of the Human Centipede movies to narrate, do an abridged version of that Thomas De Quincey.
Dieter Laser, or like one of the that's regardless of whether or not it was him, because I also know him from that old show Lex. That sounds awesome. That sounds like so
but
much
it's
fun.
that story that Suspiria was kind of inspired by Thomas De Quincey, so I got to write the liner notes
Yeah.
for that one too. And I think that's kind of like a London record store day release.
Oh, that's so cool.
So I'm out there writing stuff. I did liner notes for Mondo's Halloween's 4 and 5 soundtracks that came out over the summer. So I'm still trying to keep the dream alive, I guess.
Nice. We'll definitely be sharing links and different info, and of course everything that can lead folks to checking out your shows. So, like I said, Blake, it's been a great time talking to you. I'm really glad you had a chance to join us for tonight.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Wasn't sure what to expect. I didn't know if you were going to dive deep into something or just shoot the shit over something that we both mutually love. But this was a lot of fun.
Yeah, man, thanks for being along for the ride. And thank you, everybody, for listening to another episode of Freaky Fandoms. We'll be back next week with more fun stuff. And, yeah, stay freaky.